Good evening. I would also like to welcome you at the 6th Subversive Festival and the international conference which is taking place for the next week in Zagreb. As you probably know, besides Oliver Stone and Tariq Ali, we have many distinguished guests who will be in Zagreb for the 1 week. Besides the keynote speakers like Slavoj Žižek, Yanis Varoufakis, Mauricio Lazzarato, Aleida Guevara, and so on, it's impossible now to mention all the guests. What is really important for the Subversive Festival is the Balkan Forum and the Subversive Forum. We gathered around, I think, between 100 and 200 officially guests who are representatives of different organizations from all around the Balkans. Now I would like finally to invite Tariq Ali and Oliver Stone to join me at the round table about the untold history of the United States. I'll start with an easy but maybe also difficult question. First for Oliver, how did the both of you meet? You and Tariq, when did you meet Tariq, and how did your relationship develop?
I was working on south of the border. In 2009, I was in Paraguay. I was reading his book because it was about all the leftist leaders had come into being in the 1990s and 2000s. In Paraguay, there was a wonderful cardinal there who has since been removed, but he was a liberation theologist. I was reading the Pirates of the Caribbean, as well as his other books, and I said, who is this guy? To Max Arrivalles, who is now the ambassador of Venezuela to Greece. He's a Frenchman. And Max happened to know him, and he called him that night, and he said, I'd like you to meet on the phone, Oliver. And we talked, and we agreed to meet up because we needed a screenwriter, somebody who could shape this vast body of material on South America that we were building in south of the border. We had hours of footage, but we needed some focus. Mark Weisbrot from the Center of Economic Policy and Research had written a very factual script, very detailed economic, but dull, lacked that dramatic flair. In Tariq, whose writing I loved, you find the dramatic flair, the arc of drama. You find you make people watch, and Tariq's words is to me a form of poetry, political poetry, and it makes you pay attention. So we grafted Tariq's work on our screenplay, on Mark's work, and we came out with the movie, which some of you have seen. I'm very happy with it. So meanwhile, I had been developing Untold History of the United States. We've been working on the film series for 10 hours since 2008. That's another story. It was 5 years in development, and after Tariq did the work on south of the border, he came to the United States. And among other things, he did a 7-hour interview with me, about Untold History. That was in 2009 or 10, and he has his terrific point of view. We put that interview, a 2-hour interview, into the documentary, which you're going to see in its final form. You've seen 10 hours. In its final form, it's 14 hours, 12 hours of history, 2 hours with Tariq Ali on history. That will be released in the United States in October of this year by Warner Brothers on a DVD. And that will be the first time that's been seen in public.
So you mentioned south of border. Recently, a few weeks ago, Hugo Chavez died. Both of you know Hugo Chavez pretty well. Unfortunately, we live in a country and part of the world where Latin America is not so popular. And as we all know, the current state of the European Union is going into an exactly opposite direction. Could you first, Tariq, tell me why is the Venezuelan experience important? Why it could be important for the European Union? What can the European Union learn actually from Venezuela? And then we will turn to Oliver as well to speak a bit more about Chavez as well.
Well, if you look at this very intelligent but deeply reactionary magazine called The Economist, you put its two covers side by side. One is a cover after Hugo Chavez died, and the title of The Economist is very objective: Chavez's Rotten Legacy. Then a few weeks later, Margaret Thatcher died, and The Economist had a cover saying, Margaret Thatcher, freedom fighter. And that more or less sums up the European Union's attitudes in a very blunt way. They don't say it that crudely, but they say it. And why? Because in a world dominated by neoliberal capitalism, in which the state has been deprived of any role in helping the poor, but can carry on helping the rich, which it has been doing since the Wall Street crash of 2008. It's not allowed to help the poor. So any examples of countries where leaders are elected on the basis of helping the poor and actually help the poor are not popular. And so the only part of the world where this has happened to one degree or another is South America. Something which Oliver's movie documentary South of the Border demonstrated very well. But this experience is not permitted in Western Europe or in many other continents. They denounce it all the time because it poses a threat to the total hegemony of capital. That is the reason for the hostility and the lies. It's not just political hostility. Political argument is fine. But the lies that were told about Venezuela and Chavez, he's a dictator, he's this, he's that. So when we had one European leader, political leader, Alex Tsipras of Syriza, who is coming here, and he was asked, which politician do you admire the most? He said Hugo Chavez, and the entire leadership of the European Union jumped down his throat. From the newly elected Francois Hollande of France, to the Germans, to the British, all the big powers of the European Union said you're not permitted to say this. They threatened the Greek people with dire catastrophes if they voted Syriza, etc., etc. And that, in a way, is the hatred for Chavez is largely fear. Fear that that example might spread to other continents and might encourage, because to sum up very briefly, the South American experience is an experience of huge, large social movements from below, fighting against privatization, fighting against neoliberal measures, throwing up political leaders in country after country who promise change and begin to deliver. They have not completed the delivery, they begin to deliver. That was the essence of Chavez's popularity, and he was a continental leader. And when he died, his funeral was huge and attended by every single Latin American leader, including the Colombians and the Mexicans who disagreed violently with him. That is what he meant to that continent. He was a continental leader, and they are not produced regularly.
I will say two things briefly about Hugo, because one, I notice now that a couple of months have gone by, how deeply, deeply I miss him. Personally, politically, I miss his presence in the scene. He was a big man in his mind and spirit. He walked in the room and he always used to charm everyone that I saw him with, even the journalists from Britain who hated him. We did an interview. He danced with the women. He loved life, and I suppose, Don Quixote, a bit of a vigorous Don Quixote. He had a big dream. Venezuela is very, very important to the United States. It is as important as the more publicized Iran. And the other point I wanted to make is, since he's died, I have never seen, I'm shocked at the amount of hatred and scandal and slandering that has gone on in our press, people in the street, smart people who should know better, and in the European press, as Tariq has said. It is ugly, very ugly. It surprises me because what did he do that was so bad? And he wanted change from below, and he had a great influence all over the continent and in the world. When Tariq said he could not be allowed to be a successful example, I do believe that's true. I did a documentary years ago on Fidel Castro, and I got to know, 3 documentaries, I got to know Fidel Castro. And I was thinking when he said that in the 1960s and 70s, Castro's example could not stand. Same thing is true about today, but in the 1960s, at least Castro had the benefit of Western Europe, to some degree, trying to understand and often understanding what the Cubans had done. In this case, with Chavez, I'm shocked at how ignorant the Spanish, French, especially the French, who should know better, and the English press has been. I was at a dinner the other night, a hedge fund conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, with all these rich people, and I sat at a private dinner with billionaires, and it was a dinner for Sarkozy, who was there, and they were asking me a public discussion about Chavez and why I had done this documentary. And when I argued with this billionaire, and he said those elections are rigged, and I said they had the cleanest election process we know of in the world. If we had something like that in the United States today, we wouldn't have had Bush as president, and we probably wouldn't have had, we would have had a lot of these representatives from the Tea Party, and a lot of these people who got into office were really elected, I believe, electronically, illegally. But when I said that to them, they said that was horseshit, and I said, well, Jimmy Carter had gone down there with the commission, electoral commission, and monitored the elections. When I said the word Jimmy Carter, this guy jumped up, he said, Jimmy Carter, and he spit at the dinner table, and he said, that guy is so rotten, he is as communist as you can get. And this is in our day and age. This is a president of the United States who's being called a communist. So it shows you at the highest level, the elite power level of the United States, how rigid this still is. It's shocking to probably you who would say this doesn't make sense, but these people have power. They put big money. The Koch brothers, chief investor of the hedge fund for the Koch brothers was there. These people control a lot of the electoral process and the money flow to candidates in our country.
Thank you. Maybe before we turn to the US, but also Europe, and then return maybe also to history, of course. I would ask you, Tariq, today everyone actually, as you said about Economist, the paper, everyone likes to criticize Chavez, that he was a leader, a dictator, and so on. But on the other hand, Chavez was the one who made real changes in the slums, social changes, worker councils, and so on. So I would like to ask you to go a step forward to mention other countries in Latin America. For example, Ecuador. I know both of you know Julian Assange very well, and it is exactly Rafael Correa who tried to help Assange, Ecuador get rid of the American embassy, and so on. There are new experiments in Bolivia as well. So on the one hand, we have, of course, this picture of leaders of Latin America, but could you speak more about concrete examples, what changed in Latin America in the last 2 decades, let's say? So what are the good examples, like workers' councils and different things?
Well, I mean, in all these countries, to one degree or the other, there has been a great deal of state expenditure on health, on education, on providing homes for the homeless. I mean, everything that doesn't happen in Europe today or the United States happens there. And this used to be normal in most of Europe after the Second World War, whether it was Western Europe under social democracy or Eastern Europe under social dictatorships. The one thing they did in common was to produce health, education, and housing for their people in different ways. That is no longer allowed. It's verboten. But in South America, this had never happened. And these governments started implementing these reforms, including land reforms. The last time I was in Caracas was during Chavez's last election campaign. And the government had announced that that speculators who were hanging on to land, hoping that land prices would shoot up and then they would sell it, were given a warning by the government. They were told, either you build homes on that land, we are not going to tell you what sort of homes, or we are going to take this land away at the market prices today and build public housing. And that's what they started doing. And the rich who live in the eastern suburbs of Caracas said, oh, some of these houses are being built too close to us. We don't want these smelly, nasty people living next to us. But they did it. And you know, in Ecuador, similar processes, very similar processes are going on. In Ecuador, also, Korea emphasizes the environmental aspects of the social movements by delaying digging for oil, which for that country is important, in order to preserve the forests, appealing to the world and appealing to voluntary help to help create social projects so they don't have to dig for this oil. In Venezuela, in Brazil, which is it's not exactly the same as Venezuela, but the government instituted the Bolsa Familia, which is giving all poor families a monthly wage. And Lula said to the rich, I'm not going to stop you getting rich, which in my opinion was a mistake because they are very rich, the Brazilian bourgeoisie. But if you challenge me in giving money to the poor to enable them to live a slightly more decent life, then it's war. So that was the truce agreed. That was the truce agreed, and it worked. And you know, the big thing is that people are mobilized in these countries. That's the big difference. And they are mobilized for these demands. Otherwise, you cannot understand the popularity of these leaders, why they keep being re-elected. I mean, if you look at Western Europe, or the whole of Europe now, the European Union countries, it's one set of politicians are replaced by another set of politicians who more or less do the same thing. So you have a form in European politics which is very challenging to democracy, which I have described as the extreme center. Center-left or center-right come to power, and they are under heavy control by the Eurocrats and the big powers in the European Union to do exactly as they are told. And that's not exactly a good thing. So, you know, one can learn a great deal from these South American countries because it's the only model we've got at the moment. It's not perfect. They have to go a long way further, but they've started something. And the people feel they have a stake in these governments, which they feel in very few countries these days.
We could say that what Latin America a decade ago was for the social movements in the world, and we all remember Porto Alegre and the World Social Forum, that actually 2011 was for the new decade. We witnessed huge protests from the Arab Spring, starting in Tunisia, Egypt, and so on, all around Europe, and ending in a way in Wall Street with Occupy Wall Street. But what we got on the first glance is the famous quote from Visconti's Gattopardo, where they say everything has to change so everything can stay the same. in Egypt, we got the Muslim Brotherhood and the old nomenclatura. In Tunisia, 3 months ago, Chokri Belaid, the leader of the opposition, was killed. Things didn't change in Spain, Portugal. So in a way, we could also be pessimistic. But I would ask, Oliver, how would the untold history of the Occupy Wall Street movement look? What did you think about the Occupy Wall Street movement? Would you say that it failed in a way? I mean by that, if you look at the last presidential campaign by elections, when Obama won again, Occupy Wall Street, unfortunately, wasn't a topic at all. They were again speaking about the Muslims and so on, and of course, Obama didn't change the financial elites which rule the world. So how did you see the Occupy Wall Street when it began, and how do you see it today?
It's a very difficult question because I always felt, and many people would agree, that the Occupy Wall Street was powerful, dramatic, but it was unfocused. It did not have a stated goal, like stop nuclear testing or stop poisoning the whales or stop tuna fish. It was very difficult for people to relate to that because most people don't see themselves as a 99%. It's a great slogan. Most people see themselves as aspirants in the middle class, and they want to go higher on the scale. And in America, you want to make money. If you got a job, you want to keep it, so you don't want to speak up too much. We live in a very stratified society, and those people who protest, who run risks, these people some of them are very attractive, but there was an element that looked disastrous on camera. They looked like all the horrors of the 1960s to the Nixon people who voted for Nixon. Nixon was elected by a slender margin in 1968, and again in 1972 on a landslide, but essentially in 68 because people were scared of these protesters, scared of what they call drugs, long hair, crime, the people who were against the war in Vietnam. And that was much to the shame of the United States. So the Occupy people never were understood enough, totally. And I'm not so sure that they ever spoke because there was no one spokesman. They had a very interesting new way of speaking through proxies, enormous proxies, audience. But we met some of these people, and some of them are anarchists. Some of them do believe in revolution and violent revolution. And I have to say, with 50 million people in the United States living in poverty right now, 50 million people, and the difference between poor and rich growing into this gap, with our CEOs in our country, executive class, are making 300 plus times as much money as the average worker per year, 300. In Britain, I believe it's 11 times, and in Japan, I believe 14 times. These are the normal rates of difference, but in the United States, it's 325. So it feels to me, honestly, like unless the state locks down into a military dictatorship soon, there's going to be a French Revolution. And there will be not because Americans are willing to risk, but they will be so desperate that they will have no choice. From what I gather, the French people were like that in 1789.
Just mentioned Vietnam. You were both in Vietnam for different reasons. You were fighting in Vietnam, and Tariq was there because of the Russell Tribunal, and both of you are popular as anti-war activists. So my question is actually, during the 60s and 70s, we had a really strong anti-war movement all around the world. And 10 years ago, we thought we have a new anti-war movement, which is, again, very strong. We had millions of people protesting all around the world, but unfortunately, they still didn't succeed to stop the war. What we have today are drone wars in Mali, in Pakistan, even Croatian troops in Afghanistan, Croatian government sending arms to the troops in Mali, and so on and so on. So please, Tariq, how would you explain this, that millions of people on the streets didn't succeed to stop the wars? And, you know, the old Lenin question, what is to be done to change this?
Well, There's a big difference between the anti-war movement in the case of the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. And what is the difference? The difference is that the anti-war movement in relation to Vietnam grew slowly and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the most powerful segment of the anti-war movement was in the United States of America, where it wasn't just, you had conscription in the United States, where every young person above 18 could be conscripted to go and fight in Vietnam. So it affected the entire population. And so every household, whether they were political or non-political, had to discuss the Vietnam War. What is happening? Will our kids return? Will they be alive? Will they be maimed? Will they come in body bags? And that was created a very strong anti-war movement, and then this anti-war movement spread into the United States Army. And one of the most powerful demonstrations, probably in the history of imperialism, was GIs outside the Pentagon in the early 70s, on their crutches, with their medals, in their old uniforms, chanting that they wanted their country to get out of Vietnam, and some of them saying they wanted Ho Chi Minh to win that war. And I used to argue after 9/11 with some people who were defending Osama bin Laden. I said, you tell me what frightens the Pentagon more. 100,000 people from within their ranks chanting this, or a few bombs? It's obvious what frightens them more. And it was this anti-war movement in the US Army which played a decisive role, in my opinion. The loss of morale, soldiers firing and shooting on their own officers, American soldiers, on the battlefields in Vietnam, and the whole anti-war movement, and of course the heroism of the Vietnamese, just refusing to give up, that did it. So it combined. In the case of Iraq, it was very different. In the case of Iraq, it was an attempt by citizens to try and stop a war before it took place. And it was not people who were engaged in movements or politics. The overwhelming majority of the people who came out against the Iraq war had never participated in any action before. 1.5 million in London, 3 million in Spain, 2 million in Italy. In France, the figures were very low. In Germany, a few 100,000. In the United States, it was huge. Despite 9/11, mass mobilization in New York, mass mobilizations in the West Coast, every American capital city of their, in different regions had huge numbers of people trying to stop the war because they knew instinctively that the politicians were lying to them. And they said, we don't believe your lies and we want this war to stop. And when they found they couldn't do it, they went back home, very demoralized and feeling depressed. Nothing changes. You can do whatever you want, these politicians are not going to change. And that creates a depoliticization. So that was a huge difference in these two movements, which we have to understand. On what is to be done, Shrechko? I mean, this is a huge question, but I agree totally with Oliver about the Occupy movements. I spoke to them in the Bay Area. And once, at one meeting I did, they said, you know, tomorrow we are calling for a general strike. And I said, a general strike, what, of all the dockers and the workers in the Bay Area? They said, no, we're calling for a general strike, asking people not to go shopping tomorrow. Now, that's quite sweet, but, you know, it's not decisive. And the Occupy movement in New York, you know, 99% versus 1%, Oliver's right. It's not the 99% is not rich in the way the 1% is, but it's not homogeneous. There's a huge class divide within the 99%. And they avoided politics deliberately. Then you look at the indignados in Spain, the clowns in Italy, and they come up with no demands at all. Why? Because they say all politics is tainted, it's evil, it's bad. To participate in politics is to become part of the problem, and that, in my opinion, is wrong. It's deeply wrong because it ignores the big problem, which is what alternative are you proposing? And unless you do that, which Syriza realized in Greece, but which the Indignados in Spain didn't, unless you come up with an alternative politics, you can't even think of defeating the people who are in power. So you can't avoid politics. That's the lesson of these movements.
The significant difference between Vietnam and Iraq was that during the Vietnam War there was a temporary bump in which the media truly liberated itself from the old Cold War ways of thinking. We reached a place in our mood, our national mood, in the 1967, 8, 9 period, when truly we began to question what this was all about. We didn't see Moscow on the battlefield. Nixon and Johnson and Hoover were kept yelling about Moscow, Moscow, Moscow was for the Vietnamese, but people were not quite believing it. And the students, especially the students' protests in Madison, Wisconsin, Kent State, I spoke there a few days ago. On May 4th, the National Guard opened fire on 13 students, killing 4. The protests were enormous against, they continued to 1972, but Nixon, and was affected by them. Nixon himself admitted that he did not undertake a more severe bombing because of the protesters. But he did continue to bomb Laos and Cambodia secretly as much as he could after 1973. But the press temporarily was on the side of rethinking this thing. And the press became, how to say, very self-congratulatory after Watergate. But what was going on, and we talked about it and we researched it in history, well, in chapter 7 and 8, what was really going on was that when the Republicans and the conservatives in America, when Watergate happened, they were angry, very, very angry, very smart, and very in a mood for vengeance. So they set out in a deliberate manner to win the media over, to in fact buy it over. And you see from 1972, with people like William Simon, the Olin Foundation, you start to see this creeping buying up of the press. At the same time, the left-wing press in the United States, as I said, a little bit fat, a little bit happy, started to feel that things were changing and did not keep at it. Washington Post became more and more conservative. The New York Times, after 1980, became even extremely more conservative under a new editor, and so forth and so on. So the press and the media, and by the 1990s, with the changes in the Communications Act, with things like making the news private for profit, no longer a public function, all these things contributed by the late 90s to a solid conservative base in the media. In the Iraq I war and the Kuwait war, and then in the Iraq war, the journalists were embedded with the military, which is a terrible practice and allows the Pentagon to exercise enormous control and influence on what the press is writing. So there was nobody writing about Iraq or Kuwait with the same ferocity as was being written about Vietnam. So that being said, it's a tremendous problem, because when George Bush marched into Iraq, and as Tariq said, the worldwide protests were the largest protests ever seen, as far as we know, in the history of mankind. Millions of people. But you could not know that in the media. You did not know that in the media. It was relegated to sometimes front page, but very rarely. Mostly it was in the back. Because the media was essentially beating the drums of war. And this is not just the conservative media. What is very distressing about the 2002 and 3 period was how the liberal media, the so-called Cold War liberals of America, of which there are many of them bright people, were joining into the Bush agenda. And even when the UN, the inspector, the wonderful man, Hans Blitz, was saying, this is crazy, even he was being denied the respect he deserved. So there has been this gridlock of an Orwellian state, super state, where these people, the military-industrial complex, the media, the White House and Congress, and now certainly Wall Street. You know, Wall Street has an interest in controlling the world, and the United States has a very strong economic interest in dominating the entire world and making money. This money has driven our country crazy. Since 1980s, when I made Wall Street, money has become a god beyond belief to me. So these factors have destroyed the ability to dissent, have destroyed the true democratic ability. Corporations have been strengthened in my country, I don't know, I guess worldwide, I suppose in Europe. Corporations are bigger and bigger and are investing freely in the electoral campaigns. So what then must be done? As Tariq and I Tolstoy wrote about that in 1886, and I asked him what Marx would have said. And obviously Marx may be right about now, because we are coming to a place again of class struggle, real class struggle. But what then must be done if everything is controlled by the top and sealed up? Well, one thing I do believe in from history, from watching people like the exceptions to history, whether it's Henry Wallace or Gorbachev or Khrushchev or Jack Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, is that these things are never predictable. History shows us that the curve of the ball can break differently. So we all hoped that Obama would be that break. We really did. It didn't work out that way. Well, let's not lose any sleep and tears over it. Something else is going to happen. It may be, as I said earlier, some kind of French Revolution. Who knows? But something is going to change. I don't think we're on this inevitable, predictable, boring, self-destructive march to death with this super grid of control from the top.
You just mentioned the problem of media. And Tariq mentioned the title of economist when Margaret Thatcher died. When Margaret Thatcher died, leading Croatian liberal or neoliberal newspaper published an article paraphrasing, I don't know if this was conscious or unconscious, the famous motto by Martin Heidegger. You know, there is an interview by Martin Heidegger before he died, when he said, "Nu nog ein Gott kann uns retten." Only a God can save us now. He was really depressed and said, only a God can save us now. So this Croatian journal publishes an article where the title was, "Only Margaret Thatcher can save Croatia." Can you imagine this? So my question is, I actually wanted to ask first Oliver, and then, of course, we turn to Margaret Thatcher, because I think this is one of the most important questions for Europe today. Do you think, when we speak about such media, that Hollywood can be subversive? That using movies, using, you know, the huge amounts of capital which exist in Hollywood, you can change these things?
Oh, yes, I do, and I've tried to do I've been educating myself too, you know, so my feelings now do not match the feelings I had in the 1980s. But when I saw what Reagan was doing in Central America, I was provoked, because I had seen it before in Vietnam, but I wasn't completely sensitive to it, and I was not a protester. I had been raised a Republican and a conservative. I was on the other side of the fence. Tariq would have been anathema to me in 1968. I would have thought he was, you know, somebody who was certainly not of my tribe. But by 1985, with Reagan in Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and by the way, I noticed in today's paper that they got the Guatemalan guy, Rios Montt. He was found guilty yesterday in Guatemala for genocide. And I hope they throw away the key, because that's one of the bad ones. Reagan supported them, funded them, trained them. They trained the soldiers everywhere. It was disgusting. We were doing another Vietnam. Reagan wanted to stop the Nicaraguans. He was ready to go to war. He was ready to send in U.S. troops until the scandal with Oliver North broke, and he used the Contras instead. But I'm sorry, your question, I got lost there. What was the question, Shrek? Shrek.
Shrek, yeah. The question was, do you think Hollywood can change the situation? Yeah.
So I think, looking back at it, Hollywood has done more damage with its films, probably with Rambo, Missing in Action. All the conservative films of the mid-1990s were horrible because what they did in a very subtle way, and I include Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan, and I certainly point to Black Hawk Down, and I point to Pearl Harbor. Big moneymakers, all of them. Some of them very distinguished films. But what the message was very clear. It was a worship of American technology, especially in Black Hawk Down, where, you know, for every American who dies very nobly and sacrifices himself, he has to kill 100 Somalians, maybe 200. It was a slaughter, and it wasn't accurate at all. And it made heroes of American soldiers. We see that again and again, Pearl Harbor, heroes of American soldiers. In Private Ryan, which is very well done, D-Day landing, you would think there are no allies. You would think that America won the Second World War at D-Day in June of 1944. When those of you who know this, and I think you do here, know that the Soviet Union was marching towards Berlin in June of 1944. The war had been decided essentially in 1943. With the rollback of the German military machine, and all Stalin is waiting for is for the US and the Allies to land on the Second Front, which they do about a year and a half late. So all our history in the United States has been distorted by the movies and the books. We called World War II the greatest generation. Yes, many of them were great. Those who went to Spain, many of them also gave their lives in Europe and against the Japanese. But on the other hand, many Americans benefited from World War II by making deals with the Nazis. American business, IBM, Ford, General Motors, I don't want to slander any companies, but there was about 35 companies, they're mentioned in our film, who were doing business with the Germans right up to 1941, and some of them right after, and they were repatriating profits after the war. And among these scoundrels is the Bank of International Settlements, and John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles. There were many American fascists, many. That was a huge problem, and it still was after the war. They wanted to get the New Deal over with. They wanted to get back to corporate capitalism, and they put that plan into effect right after World War II with their overseas tax structure. So movies were very liberal at one point in the 1920s and 30s, and especially in the 40s, but by the early 40s. By the time we come up to post-World War II, those screenwriters are being branded as communists. The man who wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was called a communist. And they're called in front of committees. They're thrown out of jobs. Sidney Buckman was a communist. They're thrown out of jobs. Many of them were scared of working. Again, the Hollywood 10, Dalton Trumbo, Alva Bessie, Ring Lardner, many good men. And the gray list was even worse than the black list because the bosses, again, the Walt Disneys and the Louis B. Mayers, were awful. They were so anti-communist that people were terrified of them, and their word went. So very few movies get through this system. We have exceptions. I think some of my films, and also I think Syriana was a bold film made by a young independent filmmaker. I think Michael Clayton was a criticism of corporate lying and fraud, well done, and that got through on the power of George Clooney and Good Night, Good Luck. I mean, there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, we're getting Zero Dark 30 and regressive films showing everything that's wrong and not accurate necessarily about the CIA, and showing it in a way that is triumphalist. The American narrative is we must win. We win because we are right. We are right because we won World War II, because we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan to end that war. We did the right thing, and we are living with our own code of morality. As a result, movies have skewered to the right increasingly.
I would pose you many questions about movies, and I would be very happy if the three of us could discuss movies the whole night, because it's a very interesting and important question. But we will have the opportunity to speak with Oliver about movies and your own work on Tuesday evening, which will be completely an homage to Oliver Stone as well, and where the audience will have probably many, many questions as well. At this point of time, I would turn back maybe to the same question I proposed you, to Tariq, about Margaret Thatcher, actually. If we look at the European Union today, we can see that it's exactly Thatcherism which is, of course, as we would agree here, but not everyone in Croatia or in the European Union, is destroying the European Union as we know it. So Croatia is, for example, on the third place when it comes to the unemployment among young people. First are Greece, second is Spain, the third is Croatia. And we are joining the European Union in 1 month, and the political elites are convincing us things will get better when we join the European Union. Although all statistics show that all countries in the European Union, exactly because of Thatcherism, are going down. So how do you explain that this ideology is still alive and that the current European Union, the Troika, Barroso and so on, are actually doing the same which they have been doing the last 20 years and that the things are not changing in this sense? We can turn to Tsipras, and he will be here, of course, but I would like to hear how, if you look to Great Britain, where you're living, and the privatization of the railway system, for example, it was a huge disaster. But now, just a few months ago in Croatia, people are speaking about the possible privatization of the railway system.
Look, I don't know which Croatian magazine was idiotic enough to say that we need Margaret Thatcher after she died. Because if they want her corpse, they are very welcome to it. Many people in Britain will want the corpse to come to Croatia. You can do whatever you want to her. But the problem is, the real problem is this. A minority government, because that is what the Thatcher governments were, she was always elected by a minority of the British people, never a majority, including after the Falkland War. Because of the electoral system in that country, which is not proportional, you can have these exaggerated results. Had you had a proportional system, a proportional representation, Thatcher would not have been elected. There would have probably been Labour-Lib Dem coalitions. So it's worth reminding ourselves that there was always a strong opposition to her when she was alive. The plan she pushed through, of course, in Britain, was what? It was not just her, it was increasingly a tendency of global or European and American capitalism to end the post-war consensus. And this post-war consensus I have described was effectively social democratic consensus all over Europe, East and West, and to a partial extent, the Roosevelt reforms in the United States. Thatcher, and not Thatcher alone, but many, many European leaders decided the time had come to go. She took the initiative with Reagan in making this possible by doing it in Britain. But even in Britain, initially it was done carefully. Thatcher's biggest victory was not privatizing a few things or celebrating money or selling public housing. She could only do that by selling North Sea oil and distributing the money effectively to win workers to buy their own houses, to give cheap loans, etc. Thatcher's big victory was a political victory, that she effectively won over the opposition. She destroyed British social democracy, and the people who followed the Conservative government after its defeats, Tony Blair's Labour Party, loved her. Effectively, Blair was a continuation of Thatcher's policies. So what happened was that the consensus on the basis of which the ruling parties ruled Britain changed. The new consensus was a neoliberal consensus, privatization, deregulation, permitting private capital to enter hitherto hallowed domains of social provision, saying that everything would be improved by the market, and that became a universal panacea. And it's failed. It's very interesting that this particular consensus, which came to an end technically and economically with the Wall Street crash, still carries on, and politicians still carry on talking as if nothing had happened. Just because nothing has happened to their bank balances, they think nothing has happened. So you have now a symbiosis between big money, corporate capital, and politics, and politicians as a social layer. Not, of course, all politicians, but quite a large majority of them. The big scandals at the moment in the French Socialist Party. What they said in their campaigns is being disproved by their cabinet ministers who are put in charge of making sure that the laws are not broken. They're breaking the laws themselves on the financial side of it. And it's the same in Britain. It's the same in Spain, the same in Italy. So the system has failed. The problem is that within the mainstream political structures of Europe, there is no alternative. That is absolutely true. Because the opposition parties have accepted this consensus. And so how this new alternative is built does become extremely important. And you know, when you ask me, and people ask in different parts what is happening in Europe, you point to Syriza. There are small developments in France and Germany, but not on that level. In Britain, absolutely nothing. Nothing. So what is going to happen after Croatia joins the European Union? Probably it will remain the same. I don't think all that much will happen. I think if the European Union sends in auditors to check the bank balances and the bank accounts of Croatian banks, there probably will be lots of scandals that will come out. I don't know this, but this is what has happened everywhere else, so I don't think Croatia or any other small country coming in is immune. The problem now is the one of employment. You say there are 50% youth unemployment in Croatia. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same in a number of countries, roughly the same, more in Spain. But so the Croatian citizens will win the right to travel. They are not going to be permitted the euro, and you should be grateful for that. But you will be allowed, young people can travel, but where will you travel to get the jobs? That is now a big problem. And there are not all that many. In France, no. Big unemployment, youth unemployment. In Britain, no. Unemployment is rising. So there is now a generalized social crisis of the system. And this needs to be dealt with, and so far there are no visionary politicians in the big countries of Europe who are even proposing the beginnings of an alternative. And they never do unless there is real, sustained opposition from below. So without that opposition from below, social movements which challenge and threaten them, they will do nothing but carry on as they have been. So the decision does not depend on the politicians. The decisions to change depends on the activities of ordinary citizens. Without that, I don't think you will get a move forward.
This consensus at the top is very powerful. They win. We can talk all night about what's wrong with them, but I had an interesting experience Thursday night when I sat there and watched Sarkozy address these American hedge funders. There was a large audience. They approved of him. He has, of course, been the pro-American candidate. You know, when Bush was in office, he was a big Bush supporter. They call Sarkozy l'Américain. But none of the hedge funders, as I tried to point out later, understood that the French people threw him out. And there was a reason for that. What Sarkozy's delivery, his speech was very powerful. He's very kinetic. He looks great on television. Beautiful hair, very concentrated eyes. And he started his evening by describing the Holocaust of 1930s, 40s. And he said, now we have had peace in Europe since 1945. And we must keep that peace. And the euro, basically, I'm making a long speech shorter, but the euro is the bulwark that will protect us against this chaos. And I said, wow, this guy really has his history a little bit screwed up because, you know, he's very powerful, that's why he's a politician, but he makes, his context is what's wrong. It begins with the Holocaust and it ends with the euro providing peace and a bulwark against another Holocaust. It doesn't seem to be, he has a good sense of European history, among other things, because I saw it right away, you know, after Napoleon Bonaparte brought the chaos to the world, there was a huge peace that reigned in Europe for almost 100 years before World War I. And if Mr. Sarkozy had examined the causes of the World War I, it would have been very clear that it was the empire and the profit motive that drove these European countries to each other's throats. And it was primarily the German versus the English, and the Germans trying to get a piece of the British action in the world that drove this insane war that devastated us. So it was money, empire, the domination of others that drove the world to this place. And of course, without going into it, World War I is the mother of World War II. And World War II essentially starts for economic reasons and becomes nationalist as we go, and fascist. But Sarkozy starts with the Holocaust, and he threatens people, and his demeanor, the way he speaks with sharp gestures and bursts of energy, very powerful. But they remind me of other speakers like that who did very abrupt gestures. And I say, you know, because he ended this whole thing with how the euro is going to save the world, it makes me very suspect about the euro, which I used to like it, but when I saw what happened to the old Europe that I liked, I always think about Europe of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when I grew up as being a culture of quality. Quality of life was more important than making money, was more important. People did not have to have huge bank accounts. They were content with peace. So what's driven Europe apart is this economic rivalry. Now, all of a sudden, Sarkozy is unable to see the irony when he said that Germany, we owe Germany, is our new leader in this world. He did not see the irony of the results of World War II with Germany now on top again, and he does not even see it seems to me, he did not see the possibility for war that exists now when you have Greeks hating Germans and Germans hating Greeks and Italians and Spanish. There's new divisions that are coming again from economic reasons that will lead to nationalistic fervor once again. And I think Mr. Sarkozy might be very well one of those leaders in the future because he's young enough who will be leading the way to war.
Thank you so much. I think it is exactly the untold history of United States, which is really powerfully deconstructing the ideology of peace, not only in Europe but also United States. But we don't have much time to go into detail, so my suggestion is we open the floor for the questions from the audience, because I'm sure there are many questions, and please just raise the hand. Okay, first hand, second hand.
Hello, this question is for either of you. It's about the relationship between Hollywood and Washington, and probably more insidiously, the growing relationship between Hollywood and the presidency. So for example, recently I watched the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and it's typical to have celebrities there. but also included in the evening, where it was not one, but two short parody films, both directed by Steven Spielberg. The first one was a spoof on the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that goes on to get tickets to this event, and specific seating, who wants to sit next to whom. And so, I mean, this starred Kevin Spacey. But the second one was actually a film starring Obama himself, and it highlighted the recent Emmy winning of the film Lincoln, where Steven Spielberg was asked, who would you get to play Obama? And he said, of course, Daniel Day-Lewis. So Obama was playing Daniel Day-Lewis, playing himself. And I found it quite tasteless, because it seems like there's a tightening between the political actor and the professional actor. So I wonder if you can comment on this trend and the social implications of this relationship in a society that doesn't understand the difference between the two.
Well, all I can tell you is I know that they hate me. I've had no cooperation ever from the White House or the Pentagon. And we talk about this relationship. Yes, it's very dangerous, as the same way that when journalists are embedded into the military, as they were in the 1980s and 90s, and it becomes a sick relationship. And there's very few journalists that have the integrity to stand apart. Michael Hastings comes to mind at the Rolling Stone, who did that piece on Stanley McChrystal. Jeremy Scahill comes to mind for writing a book, wonderful book called Dirty Wars, about our drone attacks and what they do to the people, the civilians in Yemen and Pakistan. So these are the kind of journalists that are young, aggressive, and different. We need more of them. But I'm so sick of this relationship where Washington comes to Hollywood for money constantly, and we end up making movies about the American president as if he's our buddy, and we don't examine the real things that are going on. I don't know anything about this thing you talk about, the skit, but I can see it. I mean, it's part of that incestuous relationship that has grown up between the Pentagon, the White House, and Catherine Bigelow, when she made Zero Dark 30. At first, she boasted about the cooperation of the CIA, and then, of course, she was running from that as fast as she could. So which is it, you know? But there's nothing good in this. There's nothing good that's going to come out of this. What we need is strong criticism like Frank Capra would give, or there are many European filmmakers. We need to criticize our leaders because they are really leading us astray here. And I think history, I'm very proud of this. It's really my life achievement because it's the culmination of all my mature thinking. And I really hope that it can have some impact on the future younger people.
Tariq, if Oliver would do a movie about Lenin, who would be the best actor to play the role?
No, not Obama. Definitely not Obama. Or Dan Day-Lewis. We would have to look for one. I don't know.
Maybe Leonardo DiCaprio. So we have another question here, and then we have another question there as well. Yep, and more. Please, here.
Can you hear me? It wasn't really a question. It was in relationship to your comment about the White House dinner. There's a little anecdote in the Untold History book about, I think it was a year or two ago, when President Obama was making a joke about too many people being into his daughters, and the Jonas Brothers, who are a big band in the UK, in the US, being into his daughters. And he made this joke saying, you know, watch out, or I'm going to get a Predator drone to attack you, to the Jonas Brothers. And this is when, you know, we're killing thousands of innocent civilians, and the president thinks it's funny to make a joke about drones. Just to add to the list of people you mentioned, Oliver hosted a little discussion at his house the other night. And there's an online news show that's the biggest news show in the world, and it's called The Young Turks, and they're fiercely independent. You know, they're not like MSNBC, which just is pro-Obama, or like Fox. They've just reached 1 billion views, and they're very critical of the tightening relationship between the media, the sort of courts media and the White House. So I just want to mention them, and the great Glenn Greenwald, who writes on The Guardian as well, is very good.
Thank you for the comment. There is a question there. Can you please raise? Yeah, there.
Good evening to everyone. Mr. Stone, thank you for coming here, and hopefully we'll become a traditional guest like Mr. Ali to this festival. After having seen your documentary, your 10 episodes, I think there could be an alternative title to it, What If? Because there are a lot of what ifs during the documentary. So I would apply the same tactics and raise a few what if questions. What if the documentary started 50 years earlier than it actually starts? Would that have added something more to the understandings of the complexity of the events that...
Yes, we start, actually the 12 hours that I talked about earlier, that is going to be released in October in the United States only, but you could get it on Amazon. That starts with the Spanish-American War, which is a key war. It's our first overseas war for empire. We annex the Philippines and basically over Cuba. That's really the beginning of American overseas adventurism at that level. And it goes up to the causes of World War I, which are, World War I is amazing. But frankly, we didn't put it on the air because we had a commercial issue. Showtime had its, World War I and post-World War I had such a different list of characters, and it's so foreign to the American upper teenager, 18, 17, we're trying to reach that level, that I think it's too thick, it's too dense for them to understand. That's not to say that some of them won't, but so we decided to start with World War II because that is more known as the American War, you see. So I knew that would be a problem because I knew we were explaining Stalin and our view of communism, Russia, and what Russia really meant. The Russian Revolution is a key factor in Woodrow Wilson's reactions. America, as you know, sends troops to join the armies against Russia, and the Russians had mistrusted us from the get-go until Roosevelt actually recognized them in 1933. All this was important background, and unfortunately, because of the demands of American marketplace, they were left out. But it will be resurrected.
And my second question, what if your documentary in some way ignites some kind of uprising, let's for example, in United States? Would you be pleased? And because probably your intention is to raise some questions, especially in the United States of America.
Listen, in the United States, no one sits for more than 10 hours on anything except making money. So I doubt that the class of people who would see this would have the inclination to violently protest. I think a true revolution comes from desperation, as it was in Russia and as it was in France. And it's not to say it's not going to happen here. The Soviet revolution of 1989 under Gorbachev is fascinating because it's a much slower imploding one. It's where a top guy sees the mess inside and he decides to change the strings. Not to pull the strings so tightly. He believes in socialism, democratically applied, and it starts to happen, but it starts to get out of control. And I think you should study that. We go into that in you've seen it, right? So in chapter 8, Reagan, Gorbachev, I think it's a fascinating study of what happened and what happens in the 1990s in the Soviet Union with the United States, in Russia rather, with the United States coming back in and bringing capitalism to Russia. And shredding the place, destroying the Russian Russian pension plans, and destroying the Russian the poverty level in Russia jumped up in the 90s, as did the lifeline. What do they call it? The quotient, the lifeline. The lifeline dropped like 10 years for men and about 5 years for women. So quickly, people were dying of heart attacks. Their pensions were gone. What happened in the 1990s was a really horrifying view of what capitalism did. And what we didn't argue at all tonight, but the key moment is that year, is because what happens to America after the Russians go away? We have an enemy, so-called, and we have a framework. After that, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, is when things should have gone back to a more normal state in the United States. It was very clear that there would be no peace dividend. We were invading Panama a month after the Berlin Wall fell. We were invading Kuwait in '92, right after the Gorbachev and Yeltsin took over. So the United States' naked aggression was so evident, it was shown to the world. I'm sure you understood it, but in America we did not. We switched enemies without thinking. We switched from communism to drug lord, to dictator, mad dictator. If you remember, Bush Sr. compared Hussein repeatedly to Hitler. And Bush was making up stories. There was public relations stories about what the Iraqis had done to the Kuwaitis. It was, we will not let this stand. It was like, he was like Winston Churchill all of a sudden back in 1939 saying, we will not have this Neville Chamberlain policy of appeasement. This was the general tone of Bush's talk. So, and then we, of course, had the convenience of declaring terrorism the international enemy number one, which is requires further talk, but we don't have time right now.
So maybe we can just take 2 last questions.
What is the role of citizens now in order to re-establish trust and confidence in politics? And do you think, because this is something also Mr. Ali has mentioned, the role of citizens now, is there maybe a space for imagining a kind of international citoyen to give a new meaning to politics?
Well, I already talked about this earlier during the discussion. What you say is certainly accurate, that young people are getting more and more alienated from politics. Others are being attracted to forms of right-wing extremism again. This is very noticeable. You know, we have Syriza in Greece, but we also have Golden Dawn, which is an open fascist organization with links to the Greek security state. And we have similar, I mean, it was interesting in one opinion poll I saw in France that a majority of young people, or those who were polled, because one has to be careful, were very sympathetic to Marine Le Pen, not the left. In Italy, young people have happily voted for Berlusconi. So it's a combination of 2 things, one alienation and one desperation, which drives people in this direction. And there's no magical solution for it. You know, citizens have different interests. They believe in different things. So unless you have a political platform, which can even be very simple, 5, 6 elements in that political platform to try and mobilize support for, it's, in my opinion, not possible to move forward. You know, you look at the citizens of Europe, forget the world. What about the citizens of Europe? I mean, they're sympathetic to each other, but they're not showing huge solidarity with each other, with what's happened to Portugal, what's happened to Spain. Have you had any huge mobilizations for that? No. Because what this particular system under which we are living does, it also atomizes the consciousness of people and of individuals and of masses, and it can only be resisted politically. There is no other way, and it's a long way, but the crisis of representative democracy is essentially summarized in the formula that the reasons for the crisis is that it's not representative of the entire population. And those sections of the population who previously felt that they had been represented are no longer feeling in that way, and for good reasons. So new movements, new organizations have to be created. There is no shortcut. There is no way out of it. And it seems depressing now, but things can change very, very quickly, as they did in Greece, for instance, with Syriza, a party which was on 10%, which jumped up to over 30% very quickly, because the consciousness of the people changed, and they said what they're saying is correct. We have someone arguing for us. And that's a similar thing that happened in South America. So there is no way out of politics. That is what I'm trying to insist on, that these social economic crises they exist on their own. It's not just the bankers, it's not just capital, it's the entire political class which backs them and is linked to them. And unless that is challenged, we will still be having these discussions year after year after year.
I don't want to close on a note. I'd like to close on a note of hope, because, you know, those of you are young enough to remember, you know, we've had 3 huge breakthroughs in our era. There's a Gorbachev revolution in Eastern Europe is a stunning example of change without violence. Stunning. And gave us great hope. I remember those days, and like it was yesterday. The CIA and all these intelligence agencies told us nothing about it. It came suddenly, without expectation. And we had the Obama victory in 2008. It was a wonderful moment of people mobilized around this guy. And okay, he wasn't what we thought he was, but imagine the hope and imagine that power. And you see it, and you know it can happen again and again. We have in the United States, I see a lot of young people who do go out there and are very mobilized around voting regulations now, because the right wing, the Republicans have made such an effort to disenfranchise the black vote in our country, and successfully. They gerrymandered many states and changed the rules in Ohio, Texas, ugly stuff. You know, but what's true in history, in the Frank Capra films that I love so much, is we know they're bastards. We know the villains. Their faces are all over. We see them again and again. They run things. It doesn't take a lot, but you know in the movies, these guys lose in the end. Now, in real life, it's tougher, true, but we know who the enemy is, and we are attacking them constantly with voting regulations. We're trying to get money out of politics. There will be a young leader that captures the imagination again. These things will break differently, but we have to hang in there, and we do have to stick together to politics, because politics is still the best way to change things to get leaders in there, new leaders, and there are a new generation. So don't give up. Don't give up. Don't become like Shreko here, too cynical, please.
Thanks for the compliment. So we have more questions. Please raise your hands and don't be cynical. Another question there, yep.
Yeah, thank you for the last comment, Mr. Stone, because it was a bit in this line about the new generation. I very much agree with what you both were saying about the Latin American movements and the example that are for the rest of the world. I'm from Spain, and I'm involved in the Indignados movement, in the new wave of movements. I have a lot of friends in the Occupy movement, and I want to remember that these movements are actually the new generation of activists that are really trying to build from below this power that is required in order to create a counterpower that can actually confront the big challenges that we have ahead of us. So I want to remind that this is a very embryonic movement in a very first stage, learning how to deal with the situation, trying to create a movement without leaders, with different structures. So, and about it was out of focus, I think the Occupy Wall Street movement had a quite good focus. They said, our enemy is Wall Street, and what we want is to reduce inequality, which is the reason for these big differences of power. So I think there is quite focus that needs to be developed. My question will be, how can we learn from this Latin American experience that you are quite expert here in Western societies, where we live in the core capitalist countries with quite differences? Because the big revolutions have always been in the periphery of the capitalist empire, no? We are in the core. How can we learn what we need to move forward? Thank you.
Did you see this Chilean film, No? Yes? The No is brilliant, brilliant film, because the Pinochet regime, they have been in power. They assume that they are going to win the election because they can swing certain things, and they allow a referendum, yes or no. And you vote yes for order, economic prosperity, because Pinochet apparently provided economic prosperity, and he doesn't think he has a chance of losing. No, negative, you're against the regime. They think they're going to sweep it. And this young executive advertising genius invests his energies in creating a no, so that most people will vote no. And he does it by using happiness as a theme for no, which doesn't make sense, because if you vote no, you're happy. And he creates an advertising campaign with great music and wonderful imagery, like a Pepsi-Cola campaign, and he makes no attractive over yes. And by the way, historically, the no did win the referendum in Chile, which led eventually to the ouster of Pinochet. So it was a tremendous reversal, and it shows you the arrogance of power and the people who are in power and their misuse. Their misuse. They always make mistakes. Remember, these bastards make mistakes. They made a huge mistake in Vietnam. They were arrogant. They thought we'd won World War II. How the hell are we going to lose against a bunch of fourth-rate Vietnamese, right? We're going to bomb the shit out of them. That didn't work. Nothing worked. So you got to, power makes mistakes because they're stupid and they're arrogant. Now, in the U.S., they're pretty sharp. There's no question. Because when the Republicans saw this coming, they started to change the voting rules, keep the black people out, now we're going to make a big effort to sweep the Hispanic vote. We're going to go out and sing mariachi or something, and we're going to get the Spanish people to vote for us. We're going to allow some immigration into our country with Spanish people. So they're very sharp. They respond. They're not going to make mistakes the way the Pinochet regime made it. But they make mistakes, and they will again. That's all I can say about that. Tariq, yeah.
Just feel one's repeating oneself here, but you know, it's absolutely true what you said, that within the core capitalist countries of Europe, the conditions have been very different, especially since the Second World War. I mean, Spain is exceptional because of the dictatorship, which lasted a long time and which deformed Spanish politics for a long time. And the transition to democracy was very weak, in my opinion, because a republic, however bad, was transformed into a monarchy. And backed by the left parties backed the monarchy in Spain as part of the transition, which was a backward step. But it's the causes of the crisis in Spain you can take back to the dictatorship and the way in which the building industry, for instance, to give you one example, was encouraged to stop any arguments for public housing, the privatizations which took place under Franco and which continued, including under Felipe González, the socialist prime minister. And when this crisis came, all this came to a head in Spain. So, you know, I go to Spain a lot. I remember speaking at the Complutense University in Madrid, saying that these politicians are who they are, but in order to challenge them, we need big movements, but these movements have to move beyond occupying public spaces. It's very important, the occupations, don't get me wrong, and I totally support them. But I looked also to the Arab situations. You know, during the uprising in Egypt, huge mobilizations, not just in Tahrir Square, which is what we saw on the television screens, but in many Egyptian cities. For 3 days, Alexandria had no authority at all. The security forces fled, the police fled, and it took 3 days before the army came and was allowed in. And I asked some Egyptian activists, I said, did it occur to no one to say this city is ours and set up a popular assembly from the different areas to take charge of the city and already begin to act in a different way and negotiate the terms on which that army was allowed to re-enter the city. They said no. It didn't occur to us. Well, it's an obvious thing, but the reason it didn't occur is precisely because they were very brave, courageous people, but there were no political, social movements in that city to say, let's go that way. Let's occupy Alexandria and show the people in Cairo, in Suez, how it can be done. Had they done that, who knows? You know, it's the what if question. If Alexandria had become an independent commune, if you like, the example of that would have been phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. But these ideas are, people don't think about them because A, there's a loss of historical memory, very deliberately cultivated by the world in which we live, and also because some of these ideas are associated with old political parties. That, I think, has to change. I think the Indignado movement will not last, however much we love it, and I do, because they do very good things socially, like helping migrants who are under attack. I know all that. But without moving to the next stage, which is the formation of a broad political movement with political demands, we will face problems. That's what I've been saying this whole evening, because there's some things we know from the past which are necessary again. And the young generation will learn that in their own way, not like we did. They learn that in their own way, but it's a lesson which needs to be studied and learned. And also all the mistakes of the old style of organizations have to be avoided. So we learn both from our mistakes, but also from what has been achieved in the past by revolutionary movements and revolutionary struggles.
And now the end has come, and I would like to really try to get a big applause for Oliver Stone and for Tariq Ali.
In the 70s, Castro's example could not stand. Same thing is true about today, but in the 1960s, at least Castro had the benefit of Western Europe to some degree, trying to understand and often understanding what the Cubans had done. In this case, with Chavez, I'm shocked at how ignorant the Spanish, French, especially the French, who should know better, and the English press has been. I was at a dinner the other night, a hedge fund conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, with all these rich people, and I sat at a private dinner with billionaires, and it was a dinner for Sarkozy, who was there, and they were asking me a public discussion about Chavez and why I had done this documentary. And when I argued with this billionaire, and he said those elections are rigged, and I said they had the cleanest election process we know of in the world. If we had something like that in the United States today, we wouldn't have had Bush as president, and we probably wouldn't have had. We would have had a lot of these representatives from the Tea Party, and a lot of these people who got into office were really elected, I believe, electronically, illegally. But when I said that to them, they said that was horseshit, and I said, well, Jimmy Carter had gone down there with the commission, electoral commission, and monitored the elections. When I said the word Jimmy Carter, this guy jumped up, he said, Jimmy Carter, and he spit at the dinner table, and he said, that guy is so rotten, he is as communist as you can get. And this is in our day and age. This is a president of the United States who's being called a communist. So it shows you at the highest level, the elite power level of the United States, how rigid this still is. It's shocking to probably you who would say this doesn't make sense, but these people have power. They put big money. The Koch brothers, chief investor of the hedge fund for the Koch brothers was there. These people control a lot of the electoral process and the money flow to candidates in our country.
Thank you. Maybe before we turn to the US, but also Europe, and then return maybe also to history, of course. I would ask you, Tariq, today everyone actually, as you said about economists, the paper. Everyone likes to criticize Chavez, that he was a leader, a dictator, and so on. But on the other hand, Chavez was the one who made
America that we were building in south of the border. We had hours of footage, but we needed some focus. Mark Weisbrot from the Center of Economic Policy and Research had written a very factual script, very detailed economic, but dull, lacked that dramatic flair. In Tariq, whose writing I loved, you find the dramatic flair, the arc of drama. You find, you make people watch, and Tariq's words is to me a form of poetry, political poetry, and it makes you pay attention. So we grafted Tariq's work on our screenplay, on Mark's work, and we came out with the movie, which some of you have seen. I'm very happy with it. So meanwhile, I had been developing Untold History of the United States. We've been working on the film series for 10 hours since 2008. That's another story. It was 5 years in development, and after Tariq did the work on south of the border, he came to the United States. And among other things, he did a 7-hour interview with me, about Untold History. That was in 2009 or 10, and he has his terrific point of view. We put that interview, a 2-hour interview, into the documentary, which you're going to see in its final form. You've seen 10 hours. In its final form, it's 14 hours, 12 hours of history, 2 hours with Tariq Ali on history. That will be released in the United States in October of this year by Warner Brothers on a DVD. And that will be the first time that's been seen in public.
So you mentioned south of border. Recently, a few weeks ago, Hugo Chavez died. Both of you know Hugo Chavez pretty well. Unfortunately, we live in a country and part of the world where Latin America is not so popular. And as we all know, the current state of the European Union is going into an exactly opposite direction. Could you first, Tariq, tell me why is the Venezuelan experience important? Why it could be important for the European Union? What can the European Union learn actually from Venezuela? And then we will turn to Oliver as well to speak a bit more about Chavez as well.
Well, if you look at this very intelligent but deeply reactionary magazine called The Economist, you put its 2 covers side by side. One is a cover after Hugo Chavez died, and the title of The Economist is very objective: Chavez's Rotten Legacy. Then a few weeks later, Margaret Thatcher died, and The Economist had a cover saying, Margaret Thatcher, freedom fighter. And that more or less sums up the European Union's attitudes in a very blunt way. They don't say it that crudely, but they say it. And why? Because in a world dominated by neoliberal capitalism, in which the state has been deprived of any role in helping the poor, but can carry on helping the rich, which it has been doing since the Wall Street crash of 2008. It's not allowed to help the poor. So any examples of countries where leaders are elected on the basis of helping the poor and actually help the poor are not popular. And so the only part of the world where this has happened to one degree or another is South America. Something which Oliver's movie documentary South of the Border demonstrated very well. But this experience is not permitted in Western Europe or in many other continents. They denounce it all the time because it poses a threat to the total hegemony of capital. That is the reason for the hostility and the lies. It's not just political hostility. Political argument is fine. But the lies that were told about Venezuela and Chavez, he's a dictator, he's this, he's that. So when we had one European leader, political leader, Alex Tsipras of Syriza, who is coming here, and he was asked, which politician do you admire the most? He said Hugo Chavez, and the entire leadership of the European Union jumped down his throat. From the newly elected Francois Hollande of France, to the Germans, to the British, all the big powers of the European Union said you're not permitted to say this. They threatened the Greek people with dire catastrophes if they voted Syriza, etc., etc. And that, in a way, is the hatred for Chavez is largely fear. Fear that that example might spread to other continents and might encourage, because to sum up very briefly, the South American experience is an experience of huge, large social movements from below, fighting against privatization, fighting against neoliberal measures, throwing up political leaders in country after country who promise change and begin to deliver. They have not completed the delivery, they begin to deliver. That was the essence of Chavez's popularity, and he was a continental leader. And when he died, his funeral was huge and attended by every single Latin American leader, including the Colombians and the Mexicans who disagreed violently with him. That is what he meant to that continent. He was a continental leader, and they are not produced regularly.
I will say two things briefly about Hugo, because one, I notice now that a couple of months have gone by, how deeply, deeply I miss him. Personally, politically, I miss his presence in the scene. He was a big man in his mind and spirit. He walked in the room and he always used to charm everyone that I saw him with, even the journalists from Britain who hated him. We did an interview. He danced with the women. He loved life, and I suppose Don Quixote, a bit of a vigorous Don Quixote. He had a big dream. Venezuela is very, very important to the United States. It is as important as the more publicized Iran. And the other point I wanted to make is, since he's died, I have never seen, I'm shocked at the amount of hatred and scandal and slandering that has gone on in our press, people in the street, smart people who should know better, and in the European press, as Tariq has said. It is ugly, very ugly. It surprises me because what did he do that was so bad? And he wanted change from below, and he had a great influence all over the continent and in the world. When Tariq said he could not be allowed to be a successful example, I do believe that's true. I did a documentary years ago on Fidel Castro, and I got to know, 3 documentaries, I got to know Fidel Castro. And I was thinking when he said that in the 1960s, and
Good evening. I would also like to welcome you at the 6th Subversive Festival and the international conference which is taking place for the next week in Zagreb. As you probably know, beside Oliver Stone and Tariq Ali, we have many distinguished guests who will be in Zagreb for the 1 week. Besides the keynote speakers like Slavoj Žižek, Yanis Varoufakis, Mauricio Lazzarato, Aleida Guevara, and so on, it's impossible now to mention all the guests. What is really important for the Subversive Festival is the Balkan Forum and the Subversive Forum. We gathered around, I think, between 100 and 200 official guests who are representatives of different organizations from all around the Balkans. Now I would like finally to invite Tariq Ali and Oliver Stone to join me at the round table about the untold history of United States. I'll start with an easy but maybe also difficult question. First for Oliver, how did the both of you meet? You and Tariq, when did you meet Tariq, and how did your relationship develop?
I was working on south of the border. In 2009, I was in Paraguay. I was reading his book because it was about all the leftist leaders had come into being in the 1990s and 2000s. In Paraguay, there was a wonderful cardinal there who was since been removed, but he was a liberation theologist. I was reading the Pirates of the Caribbean, as well as his other books, and I said, who is this guy? To Max Arrivalles, who is now the ambassador of Venezuela to Greece. He's a Frenchman. And Max happened to know him, and he called him that night, and he said, I'd like you to meet on the phone, Oliver, and we talked. And we agreed to meet up because we needed a screenwriter, somebody who could shape this vast body of material on